Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Dig Into Your Day with Cover Crops and Conservation webinar series. And we're on to our fourth webinar now, which is great. So I think most people know they're on Mondays and Thursdays for the next few weeks, talking about mostly no-till and cover crops. And we've had guest speakers from all across the country on different crops and cropping systems. So it's been really interesting. The webinars are being posted on our website basically about the day after they've been taped. And so we'll type the web address in the chat box, but they are being posted on our website when we get permission from our presenters. If you need CCA credits or would like CCA credits, please email Catherine Davidson. Her email is at the bottom of the slide that's up in front of you today. And just quickly want to thank all of our sponsors that promote or help provide us funding for our outreach events that are now going to be mostly virtual. So thanks to all those organizations as well. And with that, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Joel Gruver, and he's from Western Illinois University. I think many of you are familiar with Joel. He does a lot of research and outreach in organic production systems, especially focused on weed management, nutrient management, and enhancing soil health in organic grain production systems. Oh, Joel, you're from the East Coast. I am. In your bio.
Originally from Maryland.
All right. And he's been working in farming systems and education for over 25 years. And now he's really good at online virtual stuff because he's teaching 4 classes online. So he's definitely, he knows his way now around Zoom, I bet, pretty well.
Well, I'm getting better every day. 2 weeks into online teaching.
Oh my gosh. Well, and Joel is gracious enough to talk with us this morning, even though he is raring to get out in the field and plant small grains, I'm assuming, in Illinois.
Oats and peas.
Oats and peas. So you're not planting corn yet in the...
No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
All right. Well, Joel, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen.
And I think folks know if you have questions, just type them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll answer those when Joel's finished. All right. Oh, good. Any questions?
Okay, we are at
there we
the start.
Go. Okay.
So we're going to talk about no-till and cover crops in organic systems. And as mentioned, I teach at Western Illinois University. It would be great to have some of you join us in any way, whether you actually become a full-time student or just enroll in some online coursework. We have lots of traditional students, 18 to 22, but more and more non-traditional students. So the context for the research farm that I will be headed to as soon as I finish here is that we are located about 15 miles north and west of campus. We don't own the farm. It's cash rented from a long-term landowner, and it's flat black, very poorly drained, but very productive Illinois soil. We grow about 70 acres of crops, 5 to 10 large-scale randomized complete block experiments every year, and then also some small plot work. I am really blessed to work with great people, student workers, and my technician, Andy, make it possible to do what we do. I'm also really blessed to have very supportive neighbors. None of them are organic farmers, but they are experienced farmers with lots of equipment, and we own almost no equipment, so we rent and rent and rent from our neighbors. That's my context. I guess the key thing for you to think about is what is your context for integrating cover crops, no-till, and organic farming successfully. And they're all different contexts. This particular picture is a farm in Ontario that obviously has a lot of infrastructure. some farms have a context that makes certain things much easier to accomplish, and then other things might be more difficult depending on your context. Another way to think about context is, what are your puzzle pieces? What do you currently have as your underlying foundation that fits together? And obviously, where are the openings? Where are the possibilities to add new things like cover crops? And then, of course, we need to think about how willing you are to rearrange the pieces. Because if you only think of cover crops or no-till as the missing puzzle piece, it's going to be pretty hard to find something that fits in perfectly. But if you're willing to rearrange your current pieces, maybe add some other pieces, then you can find more effective ways to add cover crops and no-till effectively. We're talking about the organic context, and while there is a lot of overlap between success in conventional farming and organic farming, there are some unique characteristics of success in organics that I like to talk about. Some of you have heard me go through a list of about 10 different characteristics. We'll just focus on 2 right now. Successful organic farmers employ farming system solutions. They also employ individual technologies, but those technologies are integrated within a farming system. And a farming system normally implies a crop rotation, maybe a more diverse crop rotation than on a conventional farm. But the word rotation, I think, is a little bit of a tricky word. It sometimes implies that you just go around and around, that you revolve the same sequence over and over again. And I think that is challenging to make work in our current system of economics, where the markets are going up and down, where we have extreme weather. So sometimes I think it's better to talk about strategic sequencing rather than rotation. And then, of course, we need to think about integration of different enterprises. Crop and livestock enterprises can be very important for farming system solutions. We also need farming system flexibility. That's kind of what I was implying when I said we don't want to just have our rotations revolve. We want them to evolve with, in response to the current context. Excuse me. So we need to have strong contingency planning. Have that plan B, C, D already thought about. We need to think about how we can make our contingency plans more successful by having access to additional equipment, labor, storage. And once again, I'm mentioning livestock. Livestock are an excellent contingency plan. They can eat a lot of our mistakes. A really useful way to think about how to put together a farming system that works for organic farming is what Jim Bender wrote now probably 30 years ago. He wrote this book called Future Harvest, Pesticide-Free Farming, that I read back in my early days thinking about these types of things, and something stuck with me that I've never forgotten. He says it's important, actually he says it's more important for organic farmers to minimize the minimums than to maximize the maximums. What in the world does that mean? Well, basically he was saying that we need to develop more stable farming systems that avoid crop failures rather than focus on just chasing the highest yield or profit potential for an individual year. We need systems that are not going to fall apart on us. This is a screen capture from a presentation by Bill Dean up in Ontario, and I think it captures this idea of why a systems approach is needed to think about making cover crops and no-till work. His work in Ontario has shown the real value of having winter wheat in a cropping system. Winter wheat, just as an individual crop, often is a low profitability crop, but there are many benefits in terms of enhanced yield and yield stability for the corn and soybeans, reduction of nitrogen requirement for the corn, You have the additional enterprise of the straw potentially, and most important, I guess, for this presentation, you have an excellent opportunity for cover crops. And it doesn't need to be winter wheat. It could be any small grain. It could be peas. But something that's harvested in the middle of the summer creates an excellent opportunity for effective cover cropping or successful cover cropping. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a sequence of how my ideas about cover crops have evolved. I co-authored this article that maybe some of you have seen. It's still, I think, fairly timely information. Radish is a new cover crop for organic farming systems. And I was one of the first people to do research on radishes out in Illinois back in 2008. We started planting radishes at the research farm, and that was my second season out in Illinois. Here's an interesting example of something that was not exactly the way we intended, but it turned out pretty well. We had had an extreme drought in 2012, and lots of things did not go as planned, but we had some wonderful opportunities for cover crop growth in the fall because everything finished so early. And here we had radishes that had just been planted, precision planted on 30-inch rows with RTK guidance, so sub-inch accuracy on almost the last day of August, right before a hurricane rolled in. So we had 4 days of gentle, warm rain. And when I came out to the farm, as soon as the rain had stopped, it looked like this. 4 days after planting, we had beautiful rows of radishes. And what you can see here are that the radishes were planted very close together. 10 days after planting, you can see that we're starting to have something else coming up in the middle. I don't know if you can see that very well, but there's a twin row of peas that's planted. And so some of the plots in this experiment actually had peas that I planted the next day after the radishes were planted. Radishes were planted with a corn planter, and then the peas were planted with a drill, but we blocked off some of the rows. Here we have about a view about a month later. You can see the peas growing, radishes growing vigorously. You can see these radish rows looking unbelievably clean, or the interrows looking very clean. We had actually just cultivated the radishes. Now you might think, why would you bother to cultivate a cover crop? Well, I was really focused on growing 1 or 2 cover crops at a time at that point in my research program. And I was trying to maximize performance of the cover crops using various types of technology, precision ag technologies, cultivation. And you can see the radishes were growing beautifully. They closed about 60 days. So we had radishes planted on 30-inch rows, no weeds at all. Now this is just one of the treatments. We also had a treatment that had no cover, and then we had the treatment that had the peas as well. Here you can see about 2 months later, the radishes are not quite dead yet, but they are melting down with the hard winter weather coming in. Now, I don't know if you were wondering about the population of those radishes, but that was not the intended population. We actually planted much, much higher, about 4 times the population that we originally intended. Little mix-up, I reversed the drive and the driven sprocket on the planter transmission, and so basically I planted a very, very high population. And the result was that we ended up with an opportunity to evaluate population effects on root and shoot biomass. And our intended seeding rate was just a couple seeds per foot, but we ended up with 16 seeds per foot. And that actually produced the most root and shoot biomass. Now, we had excellent moisture and fertility available, and I could imagine under a drier, less fertile situation that that high population might not have been the best. But that super high population actually did produce the most root and shoot biomass. And I think this is something to think about. If you're planting in the fall, the later it is in the fall, the more likely you are to benefit from upping your population. We also compared the root and shoot production where we had the peas with where we didn't have the peas. And you can see just how many radish roots and the various sizes of radish roots that were harvested from 5-foot sections of row. And we ended up with significantly more root biomass where we had the peas. The shoot biomass was not significantly different, but where we had the peas, we had more root biomass. Now, where we had the peas, we also did not cultivate. So the cultivation made everything look really nice, but maybe it actually did harm the root production, or it may just be the benefit that came with having the peas out there providing a little nitrogen. Fertility was high in this field because the nature of having it be a long drought and then rain arrive just as we had planted, lots of nutrients were available. Well, I want to just take you through a few more developments here on radishes, just so you see how we carried out this experiment and a few other things with radishes. The next spring was just as wet as it had been dry the previous season, and we seriously considered not planting those plots to corn at all. But we ended up cultivating the field, not with a field cultivator, but with a high residue cultivator. So we were just taking out the weeds that were between the rows. The rows had ridges, especially where they had been cultivated. And so after we had cleaned up the interrows with a high residue cultivator, then we came back and we planted the weedy ridges with a ridge till planter. And it was challenging. Because it was so wet, the weeds had really grown. It was not easy to do, but we ended up getting an acceptable stand planted across all the plots. And unlike our other attempts, strip till, this worked much better in terms of in-row weed pressure. Just slicing off the top of a ridge doesn't wake up the weeds nearly as much as some of the other types of strip till units that have a shank or have wavy coulters. So the yields range from 160 to 190 bushels per acre. There weren't actually any significant differences between the treatments, but this is an example of how lots and lots of effort went into setting up an experiment, and then sometimes you don't find any effect, for reasons that might be related to weather or other things that are beyond your control. Another thing that we looked at back in the early days of doing research on radish was whether we could enhance the growth of radish with extra nitrogen. This was actually a spring planted experiment, and so we had to use a type of radish that doesn't bolt quickly. So this is grazer radish planted with oats, and we doubled the biomass with 20 extra pounds of nitrogen. So that was impressive. But then what came next was really depressing. This was 2012, and the plots that had the radish, they had much, much worse soybean growth. You can see actually right in the middle of this view is a 4-row planter pass. 2 of the rows were into the radish plot and 2 of the rows were outside of the radish plot. And the biomass was about double where we didn't have the radishes. And then within the radish plots, we had the with and without the added nitrogen. And the added nitrogen that grew more radish actually hurt the soybean yield even more. I think the primary factor here was the radishes used up soil moisture. When the moisture was depleted in the spring, then basically the soybeans had much less moisture, for their growth during a season where we had about 3 inches of total rainfall during the whole growing season, and almost all of that was at the end of the season. Anyway, it was a learning experience, and fast forward many years now. We're still planting radishes, but we are not focusing on radishes as a sole cover crop. We are using radishes in mixtures. And in fact, if you take a look at this picture, you probably don't even see any radishes. But the radishes are there underneath the canopy of the sun hemp and the cowpeas and the sunflowers. And when a frost occurs and the summer annuals are killed, then the radishes and the cool season annuals keep growing for a while. This is just an example of a potential sequence and how we might use this to set us up for a no-till system, which we're about to get to. But you could see we could have a spring planted cover crop mix ahead of corn. Some of the cover crops that we'll be planting today, or I should say some of the oats and peas that we'll be planting today at the research farm actually will be preceding corn. If the spring is unusual, well, I should say if the summer is unusually dry, spring planted cover crops can have a negative effect. But normally we are too wet in the spring, and actually having the cover crops growing can use up a significant amount of extra moisture. And the point here is that we have a crop rotation that is designed to set us up for effective no-till soybeans, and we'll get to that. One of the things that we learned as we worked with radishes is that they are very competitive. And so when we plant them in mixtures, we need to keep the radish rates really low. And we typically now are only planting 1 to 2 pounds of radish per acre. Back when we were planting radishes by themselves, sometimes as I showed you, when we get the planter set wrong, we might have over 10 pounds per acre planted. Okay, let's start thinking about how we got to our focus on no-till. All across the country, it seems that we're having more and more extreme weather events, and we certainly have experienced that at our research farm. Because we are primarily receipt-driven, we're not able to do projects that don't make money, or not able to keep doing projects that don't make money. We've had to make some changes. We've had to become more nimble in our utilization of windows of opportunity. I do a lot more field work on the weekends than I ever used to. We have been diversifying our crops and cover crops. We've been using more precision ag technologies, and we have been adopting cornt systems. So what is a cornt system? Well, I actually don't use this term very much, except for when I'm talking to scientists, but cornt stands for cover crop-based organic rotational no-till. And I guess the key concept is that it's no-till being used as a strategy, not as a never-till system, not as a system that is continuous no-till, but rather you have a phase of no-till within your farming system for specific purposes. We actually have been doing organic no-till soybeans for a long time. We started in 2009, and you can see some of the yields comparing no-till versus conventional till over on the right. In the early days, we were doing experiments where we had no-till and conventional till plots within the same experiment. And pretty quickly, we realized that the no-till could work quite well, and that we didn't need to compare no-till versus conventional till. We needed to figure out how to refine the no-till. And so that's what we're doing these days. Our experiments actually have multiple treatments, but all the treatments are no-till normally, and we're just looking at different ways to do no-till. 2017 was a particularly good year. We were comparing two different soybean varieties in this experiment, and they both averaged over 70 bushels per acre. Triticale was the cover crop rather than cereal rye. We had excellent beet control, but this was actually the last year that we drilled soybeans. All the years preceding, from 2009 up to 2017, we were planting the soybeans with a drill. Subsequently, we have gone to planting with a corn planter or a precision planter, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. So I guess the key concept is, while we've been doing this for a while, we still see that there are many opportunities to fine-tune these systems. And that's what we're focusing on now, rather than comparing with conventional till. So obviously a critical question is, what does an acceptable stand of cover crop look like for a corn system, for a no-till system to have the adequate weed suppression? This particular picture, I think, shows a very good, strong stand of cover crop. It's uniform, it's high biomass production. It was planted early the previous fall, in early September. I think that was first week of September, and lots of tillering, excellent biomass production without actually a very high seeding rate. I think this was only about 70 pounds of rye per acre. So this critical question, are high seeding rates necessary? Certainly there are experiments that have shown benefits of high seeding rates. Aaron Silva in Wisconsin recommends very high seeding rates. 3+ bushels of rye, I often hear her recommending. Our experience is that high seeding rates actually are not always beneficial. Here's an experiment where the numbers are in the metric system, but we were comparing 100 pounds versus 200 pounds of cereal rye. And obviously where we had more seeds, we had more stems, but we also had much thinner stems. The stem weight was almost half where we had twice as many seeds planted, and the total biomass was actually no different. Numerically, it was actually higher where we planted the 100 pounds versus 200 pounds of rye. Why is this? What's going on here? Well, bottom line, in our experience, high seeding rates only result in higher biomass when soil fertility and moisture can support that higher biomass. And in many cases, you don't get any extra benefit by planting really high seeding rates. The number one way to get good cover crop biomass is by planting early. High percent cover in the early fall and then carrying into the spring seems to be more important than total biomass, and definitely more important than total seeding rate. So what does an acceptable stand of soybeans look like for a corn system? Well, this is a picture from back in our years when we used a drill. A drill is a controlled spill, they always say, and you don't get a perfectly even spacing. But our experience is, as long as you have about 4 plants per square foot on average, you can have good success. But that's not always easily achieved with a drill. Even if you're planting high soybean populations, a drill just does not place the seed nearly as effectively as a precision planter. We did some years where we actually double drilled. We're using RTK guidance on the planter tractors sometimes, and so we can plant 7.5-inch rows and then actually split the middle, move over 3.5 inches, and that's what you see in this picture. One benefit of double drilling is that you essentially don't need to roll. You have knocked down all your cover crops by just double drilling. One challenge with double drilling is that, first of all, it takes more time, and second of all, we actually saw that while we did have a more uniform soybean stand, we also had more weeds. All that soil disturbance of running the drill units through the soil. Our experience is that you can definitely go too high with soybean population. We are typically planting around 200,000 soybean seeds per acre. We end up with a lower population than that, but we're dropping around 200,000. We've had success ranging from about 180 to 250. This particular situation, 400,000 gave us a very thick stand, almost no weeds, and not too many beans. It just was too many plants out there competing. So where we are at today is we are now using our neighbor's 1760 John Deere precision planter to plant. As long as we take off the residue managers, we can plant very effectively into standing cover crops, and then we do the rolling after planting. And what we achieve with this 30-inch row precision planter is we can place the seeds into moisture consistently, precise placement into moisture, precise spacing between the seeds, and we just simply end up with a much better stand. And having a better stand really helps with a successful no-till system. When you have the beans packed together in the row on wider rows, they develop in-row canopy more quickly, and that gives you better weed control because it's the weeds in the row that negatively impact yield the most. You also have the benefit of coming back with a cultivator if you need to, and so we have successfully cultivated a number of times with our cultivator in this picture, but we don't. Just because we plant on 30-inch rows doesn't mean we're going to come back and cultivate. That's basically something that we decide based on the weed pressure. We've compared different soybean varieties and found some small differences. As long as you have a tall statured, very leafy soybean, and there are a number of varieties that have those characteristics. Those characteristics tend to work better in organic in general, and they certainly help with organic no-till. We've done just a little bit of evaluation of different cover crops. Mostly we've used cereal rye, specifically a rustic rye, and we have also had success with several different forage triticales. I think the most critical thing, though, is to think about how we create a system that sets us up for success with organic no-till soybeans. A system meaning we have to have a sequence of crops and cover crops. Many farmers plant soybeans after corn in conventional and in organic systems. And so many farmers that are trying to do organic no-till soybeans have tried to follow corn, and we have tried to follow corn. The bottom line is that it's often difficult to establish a strong stand of cereal rye after corn. So where we have gone is to look at different sequences that allow us to get a better stand of the cover crop. And what you can see here is a rotation where we have a mix of field peas and oats following corn. We've also done just straight field peas, but that small grain in year 2 allows us to plant the rye or other cover crops very early. We also can have a period in the middle of the summer or late summer where we have volunteer oats and peas, or maybe even additional cover crops that help set us up for a good stand of rye or triticale planted early, as early as late August or early September can give you really good success. When you grow oats and peas as a grain crop, you end up with volunteer oats and peas. This is a particularly thick stand because last year we had terrible weather in the spring, which led to lots of small peas and oats that blew out the back end of the combine. But then it finally got wet in the fall, and they they grew really well. But you can imagine this situation. You could work it up and then plant rye, or you could drill the rye right into this. The oats and peas will die and the rye will come on in the spring. This is an example of how you could plant into summer cover crops, whether it be the volunteer oats and peas, or in this case, it was a diverse cover crop mix, but we seeded cereal rye while sizing residues with this vertical tillage system with an air delivery system for cover crops. So I know I'm just about, well, probably I am out of time, but I want to show just a couple more pictures of a few other things that we're doing. We have been looking at solar corridors for a couple of years now. Every year that we've done the solar corridors, we have taken a yield hit for the corn. We've done 60-inch rows. We've also done 2 rows of corn and then a 3rd row skipped, planted to cover crops. But the bottom line is, while to date we have lost corn yield, we have dramatically improved biomass of cover crops planted with the corn, planted in the solar corridor. Cowpeas have worked really well for us. The cowpeas can be planted when the corn has already been through its cultivation. So we're planting maybe when the corn is about V5. That's what happened in this particular year, 2018. Let me just keep moving here. Another situation is what we did last season, where we had 2 rows of corn and then we had a row of forage soybeans. And this allowed us to plant everything in one pass across the field. We just took out every 3rd corn disc and put in a bean disc. This was a slick system that worked really well because we didn't need to do anything unusual. We were able to plant and then cultivate the same as if we'd had a solid stand of corn across the field. The weed control was excellent. We had the corn planted at a full population, 3 rows of corn packed into 2, and the cultivation worked really well. It's easy to cultivate when you have a solid wall of crop to flow soil into. We end up producing a lot of forage soybean biomass. These were a maturity group late 6 bean, so they didn't produce any mature beans, just lots of biomass and a significant amount of nitrogen. Where we planted these forage beans without the corn, they did produce more biomass. So the corn certainly suppressed the beans, but being able to grow 1,600 pounds or about 65 pounds of nitrogen during the same season as corn, that's pretty impressive in my mind. We also have been interseeding cowpeas into 30-inch corn, and they don't produce nearly as much biomass as where you leave a solar corridor and let the, whether it be cowpea or forage bean, grow with more light. So just to wrap up here, we only had about a 10% yield hit this past season. We grew lots of forage soybean biomass, and weed control was really good. So I'm hopeful that next season we'll carry this on even farther and figure out how to reduce that yield gap a little bit more. One key thing that we're going to do differently is we'll be indexing some nitrogen. We'll be putting some additional nitrogen right where we have the corn rows. And when you're planting high populations, you're going to need a little more nitrogen, I think. So I think we should be able to help reduce our yield hit by putting out a little more nitrogen. With that, I think I will end and take any questions.
Great, that was awesome. Thank you, Joel. It's very interesting. We're doing some similar work here, so lots more for us to think about, of course. So some questions are coming in. I know Catherine's gonna put up the quick poll, hopefully. And so if you can answer, I don't see it today. I don't know if you have it, Catherine, or not.
I just launched it.
Oh, okay, great. All right, so take a few minutes to answer the quick pull questions if you can, and I will start reading some questions to Joel. Joel, a little bit off topic, but from your experience, can we no-till corn or soybean off a hay field in organic?
That, I guess the key question there would be how you would terminate the hay field. You need to terminate your, your perennial forages that are, that are your hay stand. And I think, I guess there would be some possibilities for doing a strip till process that would remove the vegetation from the crop row, the corn row or bean row, before planting. Or potentially you could have like a ridge till planter where you have a sweep that's slicing out the hay stand just in the row. And then you could come back with a high residue cultivator and terminate the interrow. I think that is possible. Our experience is that when you have perennials out in your field, you normally have a lot of moisture being extracted by those perennials, and it compromises the growth of your corn or soybeans. If you had sufficient moisture, I think there would be much less of a problem. But I think it's critical that you think very carefully through the equipment aspects of how you're going to terminate your hay stand. And it doesn't need to all be done prior to planting the corn or beans, but it does need to get done. And those are engineering problems that I think innovative farmers are finding solutions to. And I guess my quick conclusive comment on this would be traditional strip till systems fracture the soil too much in the row, which results in high in-row weed pressure. And maybe if you'd had a long-term hay stand where the weed pressure would be much less, maybe that would be less of an issue. But in our experience, we need to be very careful with strip till because it can give us too many weeds in the worst place, which is right in the row.
Great. All right. Any other questions for Joel today before he hops off and heads to the field? I wish we were. I think we're actually getting, kind of close to planting. It's pretty dry here, and we're about a month ahead of where we were last year. There was still a lot of snow on the ground last year at this time, so things are drying out. Great. All right. Well, we are running out of time, so if anybody has a final question, please type it in. You definitely gave us a lot to think about. We were playing around with the 60-inch rows last year, Joel, with silage systems, which is very different than the grain system. So one of the things we found with the cowpeas or some of the other kind of tall growing cover crops, when we harvested the corn, we ended up harvesting a lot of the cover crop, which, just added to the feed, I guess, but then the cover crop died because it was an annual and we kind of chopped the top of it off. And so by the time, late fall really rolled around, there wasn't a whole lot there anymore. So that's something we're kind of working on, trying to figure out how to manage these same systems with corn silage so that we still have cover crops growing there after we harvest the silage.
One thing to consider, we have just figured out the equipment aspects of a new treatment that we will do this season, where we will mow the cover crop. We'll mow the solar corridor sometime probably early August, and we will be dropping cover crop seed. So the the cover crop that we are mowing will be a summer annual or a mixture of summer annual, something like a forage soybean. But we will be dropping cool season annual seed at the same time as we are mowing. And so we'll be dropping the seed in the front of the small tractor and mowing off the soybean. And the result is that we will be establishing a winter annual cover crop in immediate sequence following the summer annual.
Yeah.
And we'll be dropping the shredded soybean residues and potentially some, if we don't have perfect weed control, we'll be mowing off the weeds that are in that solar corridor. And hopefully this will be a way that we can end up with, if we, we're grazing, we would have a much more extended grazing season. That we don't actually have grazing animals, but if we did, one of the real benefits of the solar corridor system is you can grow so much more forage.
Yeah.
And if we could have a sequence of summer forage into cool season forage, I think that would be even better.
Yeah. Exciting. All right. Well, thanks so much, Joel. We really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for attending again today. Hopefully we'll see you all again on Monday. Again, if you need CCA credits, please send Catherine an email. And for the folks that are part of our SARE PDP project, we do have our office hours right after the webinar. So stay on if you have additional questions. All right. Thanks, Joel. Good luck today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.